Brother Winfred Clark was with us last year and did a remarkable job in a study of the Melchizedek priesthood and some other difficult texts from the New Testament. We certainly wanted him to be back with us again this year as we studied some difficult texts from the Old Testament Scriptures. Brother Clark is truly one of the great preachers of our day. In case you do not know it, in case you're not on that mailing list, I want to tell you about a remarkable opportunity you have. The Hobbs Street congregation, where Brother Clark serves as local evangelist, and the two working together are now publishing a paper called The Expositor. Subscription rate is free. And Brother Clark writes that every single month, and he just finished an entire series on the book of Colossians. And that's what it is. It's an exposition. It's called The Expositor, an exposition of that epistle. And see if you can't get the back issues. And if you can't, you'll want to start currently and get that publication. Write your name on a slip of paper and give it to him if you don't presently get it. And he'll be glad to send it to you. That's right, isn't it, Winfred? Won't you send it? And so make sure and do that, and you'll be remarkably blessed as a result of it. As I said, Winfred preaches for the Hobbs Street Church in Athens, Alabama, doing a great job with the congregation there. Let me tell you just two things briefly about that church. They have a very large home that cares for elderly people right next to that building. And every service, whether it's a meeting or whether it's ladies' Bible class or whether it's the Sunday services, they have a color camera that films all those services and beam to the chapel of that home. And all those people that so desire go right in that chapel and part of that service. Isn't that fine? That's fine. They have over 200 people all over the area of Athens, many out in the rural areas, that study every sermon Winfred preaches on 8-track cassettes, not the little cassettes, but these 8-track. And they have, I couldn't tell you how many units that play those things. And they have a man that just travels that whole county and distributes these all through the week. And by and large, the majority of them are Baptists. That's just two of the good works in which that church is engaged. And we're glad to have Winfred here. I've known him since back in 19, as we sometimes say, none of your business. We were students together at the old Montgomery Bible College. And it's a personal joy to have him here again this year. He's now working, in addition to these areas I've just mentioned, he's also working with Alabama Christian School of Religion as Director of Public Relations. And we're mighty, mighty happy to have Winfred here with us to speak to us on some difficult texts from the book of Genesis. Brother Winfred Clark.
Thank you, Wendell, and I'm delighted to be back this year and happy for the opportunity to be here to study this morning. Wendell was with us just recently in a weekend meeting, and he talked about the tape work that we're doing. We have a man who's a retired man. His wife is in the nursing home next door. And this man gives about 60 to 70 hours a week to that work. In fact, I suspect he spent the night in the building last night. And I've never seen a man who gives of himself more unselfishly, not only of his time, but also of his money. And those tapes are going into the homes. He makes a route of about 200 miles. 30 denominational homes each week hear our Bible class, our Sunday morning service, and our Sunday evening service. And it's because largely through the efforts of one particular individual, and the church, of course, underwriting the work he's doing. He mentioned the fact that we're working with the School of Religion. And Brother Rex Turner is here today. And Brother Turner's done a great work in Christian education in Alabama. When you start looking at the students of the School of Religion scattered over the country, you'll find some quite prominent names that are connected with that school. And the church at Hobbs Street, the elders there have allowed me to take whatever time I could to work with the school in trying to reach people who are interested in two ways. One, to attend the cluster of the classes, and two, any money that they can contribute. And so we're happy for that opportunity and responsibility. I assure you. You know, the people from Texas aren't treating Alabama folks too well these days. I think I remember Wendell, while he was over in Alabama, talking about that he was for Alabama until, and that was the Cotton Bowl, I think. We like to forget it. But I heard a story about something came out of this visit of these Alabama ball players out here. And of course the joke in Alabama is that it's not any longer roll tide, it's now parole tide. But they said that two of the players, one of the Alabama boys and one of the Texas boys, went up in a plane while they were out here. And said the Texas boy jumped out and his parachute opened. And he just floating down. And said the Alabama boy jumped out and his chute didn't open. And he reached for the spare and it didn't open. And he went right by the Texas boy. On the way down, the Texas boy saw him going down and he said, "You want to race, huh?" And so down he went. Nobody gets ahead. Not in Texas. Talk about a parachute. I'll just pass this one on for what it's worth. Said there was a fellow jumped out in a chute and said his first chute didn't open. And said he is falling. He reached for this emergency chute, the cord, and it wouldn't open. And said about that time, said he met a fellow coming up. And he said, "Hey, do you know anything about a parachute?" And he said, "Hey, do you know anything about a Coleman heater?" So the philosophy, I guess, is don't have a parachute. These passages that are assigned in the book of Genesis this morning basically center in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these, of course, are the channels through which God developed the scheme of redemption. The plan by which man was and is to be redeemed. Christ, the promised seed, was coming through Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the first passage that is brought into focus in this study has to do with Genesis 15:6. But it says in verse 6, "And he believed in the Lord, and he counted unto him for righteousness." When and how was faith counted to righteousness or for righteousness unto Abraham? Now there are people who take this passage and lift it out of its context. And on the basis of that lifted passage, and out of its context, they erect the doctrine of salvation by faith only. This is one of the things that's done when you come to Romans, the 4th chapter, and the 3rd verse, when it's there quoted. And they would therefore ignore the context of that passage, such as Genesis 12, Genesis 13, 14, and other related passages that a person might find. Then by erecting the doctrine of salvation by faith only on the passage in Romans 4:12, or 4:3 as it's taken from Genesis 15:6, and ally this against the 2nd chapter of the book of James, verse 23, where there's also a reference of that passage. And thus put Paul and James in conflict with one another. And there is no such conflict between Paul and James, because one has but to turn to the 15th chapter of the book of Acts. And there you'll find in Acts 15 that both Paul and James were together in the city of Jerusalem when they dealt with the matter of how a person is saved. There were those Judaizing teachers that said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. And then you remember that the apostles and elders and Paul and Barnabas and others came together for to consider this matter. And then after they resolved that situation, there wasn't any difficulty and conflict between James, who was there, and also Paul, who was there. And so the person who takes Romans 4 and James 2 and puts those in conflict does that against the context of Acts 15. He has to ignore the fact that Paul and James were together in Acts 15. And then later, when you have them writing, say they went against the very thing they agreed with reference to in the 15th chapter of the book of Acts. And so that ignores the context of it. There's no conflict between what Paul and James have to say with reference as to how an individual saved. But when we talk about the fact in Genesis 15:6, that it was counted unto him for righteousness, or it was reckoned unto him for righteousness, or it was imputed unto him for righteousness, just what do you mean? When you said, I reckon, it doesn't mean like some fella, and I heard some man make the statement of a fellow from Texas, and they talk about this in Alabama, I reckon I'll go. That means that I might go or I could go. That's not what's being considered here. It means to regard one or to count one. For example, if you say, I count him as a friend. What do you mean by that? What do you mean I consider him a friend? I regard him to be a friend. And in that account, it means to consider to be, to give to one's credit, or to account as it is. And so this is what you're talking about when you use the word, it was counted unto him for righteousness. It was regarded as righteousness. Well, what's meant by righteousness? Well, Thayer's definition in a broad sense would be a condition acceptable to God. Now, that's what you're talking about when you talk about the matter of righteousness. It's a state or a condition into which an individual enters or a right relationship with himself and God. Now, that being the case, isn't it obvious that righteousness is not transferred from one person to another? You will no more transfer the righteousness from one person to another than you could transfer the state or relationship of one person to another. Here's a man and woman married. They're in that state of relationship. Now, is that relationship transferable? Can you transfer that to somebody outside that relationship? Well, quite obviously, you could not. And so when you talk about the fact of his being righteous or righteousness, then, it means then that you have that state of relationship into which Abraham came. And the only way that sinful man can ever be considered righteous in the sight of God is by following the method that God employs by which he can become righteous, and where he can enter into that relationship. Thus the question is, how and when did faith cause Abraham to be considered to be in a right relationship with God? It seems to me that that's obvious on the very purpose of it. When did his faith bring him to that point where he's considered to be in a right relationship with God? And how did he continue in that right relationship with God? Well, when we talk about an individual entering that relationship, it must be through the provisions that God's made through his scheme by which an individual enters that relationship. It's God who was sinned against. And it's God who's going to provide the scheme or the plan by which a man's constituted righteous in the sight of God. Now let's go back and just look at some background and look at some things that are involved in the background of this. In the 23rd chapter of the book of Matthew and in verse 35, Jesus, in pronouncing the woes upon those that were the opposers of Christ and the things that he was teaching, speaks of the blood of Abel and righteous Abel coming upon thee. Now there's the Bible referring to Abel, who predated Abraham. And he's called righteous in Matthew 23:35. Now how did Abel enter into a righteous state? How did he arrive at the point to where he can be called righteous? Well, in Genesis chapter 4 and in verse 4, you'll find that he brought of the flock, and he offered this unto God. And God had respect unto Abel and unto his offering. Now, it does not say there that he's considered to be righteous, does it? But turn over to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous. And one translation says he had witness borne of him that he was righteous. Now the question arises, could it be said at this point that his faith was counted unto him for righteousness? If he's righteous and he's in a right relationship with God, how did he enter that right relationship with God? He entered that right relationship with God by doing what God ordained that he was to do to reach that relationship, by offering that sacrifice. Now, was it by faith alone that he did that? Was it by faith only that this individual can be considered to be in a right relationship with God? Well, go back to Genesis 4:4. He offered the fruit, the first of the flock. And in Hebrews 11:4, by faith he offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice. What does that sacrifice point to? It points to Christ, who is to become the ultimate sacrifice for all men. And so here you have an individual who's considered to be righteous, or in a right relationship with God, and it is based upon what his faith did. Now, how did that faith come? Well, quite obviously, it came by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. So where did the system of righteousness by which Abel becomes righteous before God, where does that originate? Not in the mind of Abel, but in the mind of God. But drop down and ask yourself the question, what about Noah? What kind of an individual do you have as far as Noah is concerned? Well, if you'll turn over to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, by faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by which he became the heir of, by which he condemned the world, and became the heir of righteousness, which is by faith. Now, how did he reach that point to where he becomes an heir of that designation? It's by faith. But what does he do? Is it by faith only? Quite obviously it isn't. Turn back over to the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis and begin in the first part of that chapter, and you'll find the awful condition that the world faced at that time. And you'll find that God made a decision, and you'll find his sorrow, and then you'll find God's decision, and then in verse 8 it said, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And every system that God's ever had for the salvation of man originates in God's favor or God's grace. And this is no different in the case of Noah. Well, somebody said if it's grace, then that rules out law and works. Well, look at verse 14. Verse 14, he gave him certain instructions that he was to follow, and he's to make an ark, make that ark of gopher wood. Now, does verse 14 neutralize verse 8 and eliminate verse 8 and say that verse 8 no longer can be in effect? Quite obviously not. Verse 14 actually is an extension of God's grace, isn't it? Without the grace of God, you wouldn't have verse 14. Noah would be in the same situation of everybody else lost in the flood. And so because of his grace, he gives him the instructions by which and through which, and if he follows these, by which he can be saved. Well, now that if you have law in verse 14, then drop down to verse 22, thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. Now then, that becomes meritorious then, doesn't it? So verse 22 cancels out verse 8, doesn't it? If you have him doing anything, it becomes now a matter of debt, not a matter of grace. So you have in that very chapter, you have grace, law, and works, and there's no conflict between grace, law, and work in Genesis chapter 6. It's the grace of God that gave him the law that he's to follow, and it's the grace of God that would allow him to do what he did, through which and by which he condemned the world, became the heir of righteousness, which is by faith. Now question, was that by faith alone? No, sir. And so to take Genesis 15:6 is to go against the tenor of the Bible. Is to go against the very tenor of the Bible. But let's look at Abraham's case, in the case where we have him in Genesis 15:6. Go back to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 through 3, and you'll find that it says, "And the Lord had said unto Abram," and then he tells him to get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, into a land that I will show thee. Drop down to verse 4, it says, "And so Abram departed." Well, question. Was he in a right relationship with God when he did that? Hebrews 11:8 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a land that he would after receive for an inheritance, went out not knowing whither he went." Now, when he went, was he in a right relationship with God? Would you say that he's not in a right relationship with God at that time? Turn over to the 8th verse, and you'll find that he removed from thence unto a mountain to the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord. That's 12:8. Now, question, was he in a right relationship with God then? Was he righteous at that time? Would you say that Abraham was not a righteous man in that passage? Then look at Genesis 13:14 to 17 and Genesis 14:18 to 20. And in Genesis 14:18 to 20, you'll find that he comes back from the slaughter of the king, and he met Melchizedek, and there he gave tithes unto him, and he was blessed of Melchizedek. Was he in a right relationship with God? Was he considered to be righteous, and could he consider to be righteous? And could his faith be counted unto him for righteousness at that time? If you didn't know anything else about Abraham, and the record of Abraham stopped at the end of chapter 14, could it be said of him that his faith was counted unto him for righteousness? Well, quite obviously it could. Because he's a man of faith, he's doing what God Almighty tells him to do, he's in a right relationship with God. What brings him into that right relationship? It wasn't of something of his own devising, but he's doing what God told him to do. And since he's doing what God told him to do, then his faith is counted for righteousness as it's demonstrated in what he did. What did he do? Not what Abraham wanted to do, but what God told him to do. All right, now come down to Genesis 15. And here in verse 1 it said, "After these things," after Abraham has come back from the slaughter of the kings, and after these things, it says, "And the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, for I am thy shield, exceeding great reward." Had God been that before to him? Why, quite obviously he had. But here's some problems that Abraham had. That promise of a seed had been given, and now Abraham's in a position to not know and not see how that's going to come to pass. And so he begins to ask some questions. He said, "And Abram had said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing that I go childless, and the steward of my house is Eliezer of the Damascus?" And Abram said, "Behold to me, thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir." God carries him outside, and he said, "All right, now then, look unto," then he says in verse 4, "Of thine own bowels shall thou be thine heir." And he brought him forth abroad and said, "Look now toward the heaven, and tell the stars if thou be able to number them." And he said unto him, "So shall thy seed be." Now who put the stars in there? God did. What God say? He said that seed's going to come through you. And you've had your doubts, and you've had your difficulties, and you've had your problems. You're in a right relationship with me. Now what did Abraham do when God told him that? He went back on everything he had been doing. He's an alien sinner according to the denominational world up until this time, isn't he? And it's now that Abraham believed God. And it was counted unto him for righteousness. And when he believed God, he just simply did something that was in harmony with his character all the way up to that time. And that act is taken for his obedience because it contemplates his obedience. Now you watch later as we move, because this isn't the only time this reference is made. Now then you turn over to Acts 27:25 and look at what Paul said. He's out there on a ship, and they're in the midst of a storm, and they're having all kinds of difficulties. And so after the message had been given that there's no harm going to come to them, Paul said, "Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. I believe God that it shall be even as it was told unto me. Is that the first time he believed God? Why, certainly not. But there's his sustaining faith. Would you say that that faith would be counted for righteousness unto Paul? Why, surely so. But let's move on beyond that. Turn over. Now let me make this observation. I've just made a note on my notes. And I think this bears investigation. You don't have this as the first time his faith is counted for righteousness. But this is the first time the record is made that his faith is counted for righteousness. But in Genesis 15, brethren, and listen to what I'm about to say. In Genesis 15, his faith extends beyond just the faith of Abraham on down to that covenant faith, because in the latter part of Genesis 15, God enters into that solemn covenant with Abraham, thus showing that the system of righteousness by which an individual is ultimately going to be saved will ultimately center in Christ. And no man's faith will ever be considered for righteousness that's independent of a covenant. And I suspect that may answer the question with reference to the thief on the cross. That whenever you have an individual that can be forgiven, it comes through a covenant, and faith has to be connected through that covenant. Now then, when you come to Genesis 18, you'll find that Abraham recognizes the matter of righteousness, and he said, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And he said, will God destroy the righteous with the wicked? And he knew that God couldn't go against that. And so there's the premium placed on righteousness. But turn over to Genesis chapter 22. It says, and it came to pass after these things. And Abraham's always meeting some test after these things. That God did tempt Abram and said unto him, Abram, and he said, behold, I am here. And he said, take now thine son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get unto thee unto the land of Moriah, offer him as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, and I'll tell thee of. And Abram rose early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, Isaac and his son, and clave the wood for burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place which God had said. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto the young men, abide ye here with the ass and the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and come again unto you. Now, while I've got a time, I just want to put this in. It won't cost you a penny extra. That's the first time the word worship appears in the Bible. Not the first time worship appears, but that's the first time the word appears. And sometimes it might do us good to sit down and ask ourselves and the congregation where we're preaching if that's what we mean when we talk about worship. Now, if I've ever seen a good case for a man to have a headache and not feel like going to worship, that'd be a good day to do it. Yes, sirree. Because you're going up on top of that mountain, and you're going to have 2 parts of the congregation, and one part of it's going to have to build a place where they worship. And half of the congregation going to kill the other half of it. And I suspect when Abraham was building the altar while he's there, of course he's there to offer his son, he calls that worship, he's going to render him as a sacrifice to God. He's thinking about what Sarah had cooked back at home, wasn't he? Or some big cattle transaction that he's going to become involved in before the week's out, wasn't he? Or some other thing. Why, surely not. And then when they came down off of that mountain after all of that's over, then Isaac turns to Abraham, and Abraham turned to Isaac and said, I didn't get a thing out of the worship service today, did you? Now, don't you think that may very well answer some of the problems that we have with reference to what people talk about stale worship? The problem is not with the individuals who are participating out here, it's with those individuals who are warming the pews out there. In many cases that we haven't brought that attitude. But when Abraham comes, and when Isaac said, now we have everything else, where is the animal? Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham said, the Lord will provide him a sacrifice. And when he was about to kill, and I can remember Brother G.A. Dunn standing at Montgomery Bible College in the chapel and talking about Abraham And when Abraham raised that knife, you could almost see it about to plunge into acid. And here's what Brother Dunn said. He said that if there was an angel dispatched or standing by the right hand of God when Abraham was about to kill him, he'd say, that angel say, that old man's going to kill that boy. And if you'd been an angel dispatched, you would have made that journey like that. Stop him and stay his hand. And then he turns and finds a ram that is caught in the thicket. And I read recently the thicket indicated the crown of thorns, and I think that's stretching your imagination. But when he took that ram, and then he said, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide him a sacrifice, did he not at that time see the day of Christ? In John 8:56 it said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and when he saw it, he was glad. You tell me when he saw it. When he saw that salvation is going to come through the sacrifice that Jesus offered as a substitute. Now turn over to the 2nd chapter of the book of James and start in verse 21 and put that against that context. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when it offered up his son Isaac upon the altar? Seest thou how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? When was his faith perfected? When on that mountain he offered that sacrifice as a substitute that pointed to Christ, and he saw his day and was glad. There's your perfected faith of the Old Testament. There's the obedience of faith. Now what's the next verse? And the scripture was fulfilled which said, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. There's the fulfillment of that situation. And what you have all through his life fits Genesis 15:6. He's in that right relationship. And it's not independent of the sacrifice that Jesus offered. But then we move to Genesis 18:21. And Genesis 18:21 deals with God's examination of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says, I'll go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. Now the question is, does God know everything? Well, I'll swap seats with anybody that wants to get up here. You just come up here and examine this all you want to. But since it's my responsibility, let me tell you some things that I've learned in the research of it. Look at some positions that are taken with reference to this. The Calvinists argue that God foreknew who would be saved and who would be lost. And his foreknowledge locks in that number that cannot be diminished one way or the other. So the Calvinist doctrine that God knows everything is tied to the foreknowledge that it cannot be changed one way or the other. The Universalist argues that God will not punish the man for that which he's not responsible for, and since his knowledge foreknew what man would do and what man could not do, it would not therefore be his fault, and therefore God's going to save everybody because he would not therefore be responsible. Some say, with reference to the knowledge of God, that God limits his knowledge just as he limits his power. For the T.W. Brent in his book on gospel sermons deals with this position. Then it's affirmed that God knows all that there is to be known about everything, and that God could not be all wise and be otherwise. Now those are some of the positions that are involved. Well, what do we need to look at? Well, we need to look at the fact that the knowledge of God is absolutely complete, and Revelation affirms that fact. Let me give you some passages, and let's just look at it. In Psalm 147 and in verse 5, great is our God, Lord, and of great power, and his understanding is infinite, and of his understanding there is no number. Well, now then, you can number my knowledge. You reach a point, I can't go beyond that. God's knowledge is infinite and without limitation. Now that's an affirmation of revelation. And to deny that affirmation is to deny revelation. Then if you'll notice also in Psalm 139, beginning in verse 1, The psalmist said, O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my down sitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou comfortest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. And there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Now tell me, does that passage say that God knows all that is to be known with reference to man? In Psalm 44, verse 22, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. In 1 Samuel 2 and 3, Jehovah is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. He either is a God of knowledge or he isn't a God of knowledge. He either knows or he doesn't know. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, there is not a sparrow that falls, but that God knows. I was going up the road the other morning, and I don't like to hit anything. I don't know whether it's wild or what. And a bird flew across the road and right into the front of the car and bounced off dead, and I looked in the rearview mirror. And God knows. See, that's not something he doesn't know. And he knows that. He knows that in the jungles of Africa. He knows that everywhere. In Acts 1 verse 24, when the disciples were praying, they said, Lord, thou who knowest the hearts of all men, show whether these two thou hast chosen. Well, quite obviously, he knows. All right, that's one fact of revelation. Number two, man is a free moral agent able to choose. Joshua 24, verse 15, Matthew 11, verse 28 to 30. And in Hebrews 11, verse 24 through 26, where Moses choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. So man's a free moral agent. God knows everything, and yet man's a free moral agent, and there can be no conflict between the two. Now you say, how are you going to resolve it? I don't know that I will resolve it. But I'll tell you what I think, and that isn't worth a thing to you. But in Matthew 26, verse 34, Jesus said to Peter, before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. Now I want to ask you, did that at that time eliminate his free moral agency? In other words, Peter then just becomes a pawn, and he can just be moved anyway. He's a victim of circumstances, and he's a victim of the foreknowledge of Jesus. And since Jesus knew that before the cock crow he would deny, and he actually did that, didn't he? Now I don't know if he was responsible for what he did. Was he guilty or not? Did he need to repent or not? You say yes. Why? He went against the will of God. Well, Jesus knew it beforehand that that's what he's going to do. Where does that bring me to? It brings me to a lovely Lord that is good to me in spite of the fact that he knows I'll do those things that are wrong. That's one point. That knowing Peter was going to do that and told him that he was going to do it, he did not just simply say, wash his hands of him and say, I'm finished with you. That's one part of it. We're turn over to Genesis 18:21, and this is the case of where it is said, and I will know. You mean to tell me by that God did not know beforehand what the conditions of Sodom and Gomorrah were? In Genesis 3:9, when God asked of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where art thou? Was that for their benefit or for his? Well, quite obviously, it was for their benefit to help them locate where they were relative to God. And Genesis 18:21, when it says, and I will know, it just simply is accommodative language used to show that God would not punish without the facts. He condescends to come down and investigate and have that thorough investigation so that I will know. It's like a teacher that stands before the class. And he's going to add acid to a particular substance, and he knows exactly what the outcome because he's been through that experience time and time again. And then he said, and we'll see. I'll know. If somebody comes along and they put 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, tell me what they know. Don't they know that they're going to obtain water? But they demonstrate that. And in the case of Abraham, when it said, now I know, that simply means that he has the knowledge, and that's accommodative language that would assure Abraham of God's knowledge and acceptance. Whenever you have the matter of revelation of God's knowledge and of the fact of the free moral agency of man, there is no conflict. I may not be able to understand all of it, but there's no conflict between the knowledge of God and the free moral agency of man. Well, one other. In Genesis 22:1 is the case of where it says that God did tempt Abraham. Now the question arises, is there a contradiction here between that and James 1:13, that God tempteth no man? Well, if you look at the American Standard Version, you'll notice that he proved Abraham. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, by faith when he was tried means that when he was put to the test. Well, there are certain tests of our faith, aren't there? I find, for example, in the case of the Queen of Sheba, that she proved Solomon with her hard questions. I mean, she examined and probed his mind and to see if there's any weakness there. In the 16th chapter of the book of Exodus, in verse 4, and this isn't the only case, God proved the children of Israel by the giving of manna. Well, how did God prove them? To see whether or not they'd gather it like he told them to gather it every day. See whether or not they'd follow their instruction. And that's to develop them and to bring out the best that there is in them. And so when we talk about God tempting Abraham, it just simply means that here's a test to develop Abraham and to develop his faith and to make him stronger. And so there's no conflict between that. Then when it comes to the matter of Jacob's cattle, let me just simply make these observations in passing and run by these. That Jacob provided when he placed those rods at the watering troughs. His idea, and somebody said that that's supposed to be prenatal suggestion. Well, the point of it is, this is a scheme and a superstition perhaps that Jacob had, but God overruled in that matter. If you'll turn over to the 31st chapter, you'll find that he saw in a vision the angel said. God took care of the situation. That's the scheme he used. That wasn't the same thing that God told him to do. That's Jacob's devising. Then what about the matter of her stealing those gods? What about the matter of Rachel taking those images and carrying those? Well, there are a number of ideas that are suggested as to why she did that, and these are outlined and suggested in the book. And among other things, some have said to make a legal claim to the family inheritance, and then because of the superstition that she still clung to, that caused her to depend on these kind of things. And I lean toward the idea that she is of that classification. She still had that old basic superstition that was there, and she felt like that she'd need this kind of thing when she went off over there, and she's still holding on to those things. You find people who come out of denominational churches, and they'll come into the church, they still hold on to denominational ideas. Well, when you take Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of these and put them together, and you see that through these individuals, they became the channels through which redemption came, doesn't it give you some encouragement to know that God takes this fumbling and bumbling humanity with all of its imperfections and weaknesses, and out of that he uses these as servants of his? We ought to be grateful for what God does by his grace. It's been a pleasure to have been here. Thank you.
Friends, that was a phenomenal presentation. That content on Genesis chapter 6, I want to recommend to all the preacher students of the Brown Trail Church that you get your Bibles out, as we mark so frequently, and you ought to turn to Genesis chapter 6, and out in the margin, so you'll never forget it, you ought to put grace by verse 8, you ought to put law by 14, and you ought to put work by 22, and that's so wonderful and elementary, and yet so profound and so important that it's really difficult to understand why we have problems with law, grace, and faith even today. Thank you.